Okay, welcome back, guys. Thanks for hanging in there. So we've talked about Sir Patrick Spens, right? Medieval song poetry. We've talked about metrical verse, right? We've talked about iambic pentameter by way of Shakespeare. And we just talked about the metaphysical poets who introduced all these different topics into poetry. Okay, so fast forward another 200 years. We're still in England here. All this stuff happened in England. We're not quite at the United States yet in America. But in the beginning of the 1800s, okay, beginning of the 19th century, we have a group called the Romantic Poets. And I already talked a little bit about them when we talked about definitions for poetry, right? Wordsworth, I mentioned, and Coleridge were two of the mainstays here, along with John Keats, right, and Percy Shelley, okay? Truly magnificent poets, right? Extraordinarily important. To poetry. You'd also maybe add Byron there, and in terms of fiction, certainly Mary Shelley, who wrote Frankenstein, very important. But for poetry, Wordsworth and Coleridge really got everything going here. So the Romantic poets were, you might say, sort of obsessed, or they at least introduced the importance of individual feelings, individual subjectivity, okay? Just ignore the phone there, sorry. Individual feelings, individual subjectivity, okay? And many of our sort of commonplace ideas in the 21st century about what a poet is come from this period, right? The poet is someone who's going to walk around in nature and sort of think about feelings and then write these feelings down, okay? And these are not everyone's feelings, these are just the individual's feelings, right? The individual's experience kind of written down and projected to an audience, okay? This seems basic to what a poem is, but it wasn't as basic before the Romantic poets kind of codified it and made it the way things happen. Okay, individual feelings, individual subjectivity, other things that became very important were the idea of childhood and innocence, the importance of the individual imagination, right? Okay. But in addition to these, one of the most important of their advancements was the idea of using the language of common men. They called it. This is Wordsworth's words, right? So obviously, common language of men and women. But for Wordsworth, it was the common language of men. Okay, and this is in contradiction, or contrary to, rather, sort of fancy language, poetic language that had been used previously. Okay, so if you read the Shakespeare poem and then compare it to the poem by William Wordsworth in your packet, you can see that Wordsworth, Wordsworth still sounds like an old poet, right? It's still a little, frumpy, but it's certainly a little clearer than the language Shakespeare was using. Okay, Wordsworth said, and Coleridge said, well, hey, we're writing poems. We want many people to understand them. Let's write them in normal everyday language. Okay, still paying attention to sound and rhythm, obviously, and rhyme in many cases. But let's not be cracking the thesaurus in the dictionary all the time trying to come up with the most arcane language, okay? And this is a lesson that can be very important for us, it's very important to rely on sort of language that we use every day, okay? In most cases, okay? So in many ways, the Romantics were not only looking forward, but they were also looking back, okay? Because what they did is sort of kind of went back to the ballad tradition and the work of oral balladeers, right? Things like Sir Patrick Spens, and said, well, hey, those were songs that were written for everybody. Maybe we should try and do something a little bit like that, okay? So the gist here is that Romantic poets opened up the language, right? They said, hey, let's use everyday language. The metaphysical poets sort of did the same thing for subject matter, and now the Romantic poets did it for the actual language in which that subject matter is talked about, okay? Now we finally cross the Atlantic and enter the United States, okay? And here we greet two of the clearly, I would say, the two greatest American poets, okay? Walt Whitman and Emily Dickinson, okay? Father and mother of American poetry, people often say, okay? Whitman, and I've included an example from both of them, an example from Leaves of Grass, and a beautiful, famous poem that I'm sure you've already read by Emily Dickinson, or perhaps you haven't, in which case you're in for a treat. Okay. So in the case of Whitman, he was really the first poet, he's certainly the first, well, often considered one of the first, at least, to popularize free verse poetry. Okay, he wrote in these long lines. Okay, again, the language of everyday men. He picked that up from straight from Wordsworth. Okay, but he wrote in these long lines that really encompassed everything. Okay, he wrote these poems that tried to really address every aspect of human experience in the United States, right? He wrote about farmers, he wrote about cities and factories, and he wrote about huge landscapes out west, and he wrote about tenements and crossing, on the Brooklyn Ferry to work every day, right? So the entire gamut of experience he tried to distill into these really celebratory poems that made much of the human experience. Okay, extraordinarily important, right? And hopefully later in the class we'll have the opportunity to talk a little bit more about his influence. Okay, so contrast the hugeness of Whitman, right, to Emily Dickinson. Okay, who is from Amherst, Massachusetts, and really never left Amherst, Massachusetts. And in contrast to the huge free verse overflowings that were Whitman's, main trade, Dickinson wrote short poems in ballad meter. Okay, the same meter as Sir Patrick Spens, right? So, and their poems were often very short. Okay, she didn't really publish in her lifetime very much, right? It wasn't until way after she was deceased that she came to such huge prominence as the mother of American poetry. But despite the seeming smallness of her work, the kind of non-pretentiousness of small ballad poems written not for publication, in her poems themselves, the metaphors that she used, right, the way she talked about experience, about huge things like God, and death, and experience, these the major questions, okay, she absolutely did something that no one has ever done before, right? She broke truly new intellectual and aesthetic ground. Okay, she said things that no one had found a way to say before. Okay, maybe in a way, I would argue more importantly than Whitman, but they're both such important figures that there's no use trying to pick your favorite here. So both Whitman and Dickinson in the United States paved the way for the 20th century, for the emergence of modernism. Okay. And that's the rest of the poems in the packet are by various modernist poets, okay, of the 20th century. So these modernists basically exploded all the rules, you might say. Some characteristic elements, they began to focus on the image, okay, on the image without much explanation. They said, hey, just let's, no ideas but in things. I mentioned that statement by William Carlos Williams, right? Just present the thing, okay? And so we see that in A Station of the Metro, the very, very, very tiny poem by Ezra Pound in your packet. 2 lines, right, plus a title, so really 3 lines. That's all we get, okay? That's all we get of the image, right? And it's supposed to just kind of expand from there, okay? In addition to a focus on the image, we have a sort of radicalization of the democratization of language, right? The language of the common men and women, right? So from Wordsworth and from Whitman, we get William Carlos Williams, who is going to, not only write in the language of common men and women, but write in the language of, his New Jersey neighbor, okay? So very, very plain spoken, at least on the surface, very simple, very accessible, okay? But of course, he's doing things with that language that are remarkable and smarter than just about anything else, right? So, in addition, you have a poem by Stevens, okay, Wallace Stevens, who's a master of the imagination and imaginative discourse, right? And then also E. Cummings, who some of you might have read in high school, and who is doing radical things with type spacing and grammar and kind of breaking a lot of syntactical rules that way. Okay, so gist here is that modernism was heavily invested in innovation, okay, and breaking open doors and experimentation, okay, and this set the ground for what sort of, you know, if we had to describe where we are now, we might say we're in a kind of postmodern period, all right, and that is very much characterized by a total openness, okay. We can do anything we want, or at least it seems like we can, right? No subjects are taboo. Okay, we can write about whatever we want, thanks to all the innovations preceding us, and in any way we want, almost, seemingly, right? And of course, you know, in 100 years, we'll look back and we'll say, oh, what were we thinking? We didn't let ourselves do this. We didn't let ourselves do this, right? But at the moment, it seems like we have at our disposal an abundance of traditions, okay? And not only formal traditions from English poetry, but also traditions from other cultures, right? Now that we've learned about the poetic traditions from other cultures, both English cultures, that is cultures that write in English, and then also multilingual cultures, we have this influx of foreign language writing that is truly exciting and can impact the English language itself, right? So no limits, okay, is the gist here. That's where we are right now, and now it's sort of, you know, we turn it over to you to kind of further tradition, excuse me, and make your own contributions here. So this is my little trot on the history of English poetry. Very haphazard, very brief, very muddled and confusing, I'm sure. If this was a literature course, again, we'd spend a long time more on this. But I just wanted to give you a little sense, just the tiniest sense of what's behind us, okay, so that we can keep our eyes forward here. If you are interested in this stuff, or if one of the poems really piques your interest in the packet, let me know, send me an email, and I can recommend some further reading for you, or talk some more with you about these things, okay? So today, you're going to read the Oliver essay, and that's going to give you a sense of meter, okay, the importance of meter, and this is not because I expect to spend a lot of time working with meter, with iambic pentameter or ballad meter necessarily, but because it's going to set the stage for free verse, which we're going to talk about tomorrow. Okay, and tomorrow I think you're going to find that free verse, well, despite its name, isn't really free, right? In fact, a lot of the same principles from meter, from meter verse, kind of enter into the free verse paradigm, and in fact we have to think maybe even more about structure when we're working with free verse poems, which is kind of a paradox, but I think you'll see why that is the case. Okay, so enjoy reading these older poems today. We're kind of taking a trip down memory lane here, and complete the assignment. Okay, and then tomorrow we'll head toward the world of free verse. Okay, thanks a lot, guys.